In Rome, divinity had a price. Exactly one mind for every crown. Not paid in gold, but in sanity. Every time the Senate declared a man a god, another conscience disappeared into marble. They called it apotheosis, the elevation of the emperor to heaven. But the ledgers called it something else, a legal conversion of power into worship and cruelty into policy. So the question is simple. When law itself sanctifies madness, who judges the divine? Chronicles end here, but the busts, the decrees, and the blood under Rome's stones still speak. If you value the record, subscribe, because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Nero began as a promise, a boy emperor shaped by philosophers, crowned by poets, adored by the crowd. When he took the throne in 54 AD, Rome dared to believe that reason had returned. He reduced taxes, freed slaves wrongfully imprisoned, and spoke gently to the Senate. For the first time in years, mercy felt fashionable. But power in Rome was never a throne. It was a mirror, one that showed only what the empire wanted to see. The more they praised Nero's clemency, the more he mistook adoration for truth. Within months, statues of him appeared in every forum, every temple, every province. Coins bore not just his image, but his divinity. Petitions to the Senate began with his name and ended with prayers. The state's language had changed. Laws became hymns, decrees became gospels. Behind the ceremony, clerks kept perfect records, expenditures for incense, marble, and sacrifices made in his honor. Every item had a cost, every act of worship a receipt. Rome had turned reverence into bureaucracy. To question him was not treason, it was blasphemy. Even philosophers, once guardians of reason, began to twist logic into flattery. Seneca, his mentor, wrote, "The prince is divine because he preserves the order of the world." It was not philosophy, it was paperwork for devotion. And that's how it began. The empire that built aqueducts and laws now engineered sanctity itself. The emperor was not above the law. He was the law. Every cruelty could now be justified as divine will. Every execution, a ritual of purification. Rome had discovered the most efficient form of control, holiness. But in holiness, there is isolation. When a man is worshipped, he can no longer be warned. And when no one dares to warn him, madness becomes method. The first signs were subtle, his laughter lingering too long during ceremonies, his gaze fixed not on people, but on statues of himself. By the time Nero demanded the people hail him Lord and God, no one was shocked. They had already been trained to believe it. The marble gods of Rome still stand today, eyes blank, mouths silent. They are portraits not of immortality, but of decay. Because when a man becomes divine, his humanity becomes the sacrifice. When a man is worshipped, he stops being seen. The people no longer look at him. They look through him, toward the symbol he has become. That was Nero's curse, and the curse of every emperor who followed. Rome's gods didn't live in heaven. They lived in echo chambers made of marble and fear. In the early days, Nero tried to reach beyond the walls of divinity. He disguised himself at night, wandering the taverns of Subura, listening to the laughter of ordinary citizens. He claimed it helped him feel human again. But even that was a performance. The guards followed in silence. The people who recognized him pretended not to for fear of breaking the illusion. The emperor's attempt to be mortal became another ritual, a god pretending to play man. Within the palace, the world had become an inverted reflection of itself. Senators no longer advised, they anticipated. Every speech, every vote, every gesture was calibrated to please. In such a world, truth becomes dangerous. To speak honestly to a god is to risk erasure, not just from life, but from history. Those who dared to confront him, like the philosopher Thrasea Paetus, were erased from record, their statues pulled down, their names scratched off tablets. Rome did not kill dissenters, it deleted them. Silence, not execution, was the purest form of punishment. Isolation became the emperor's true palace. Every face around him reflected his own divinity. Every sound echoed his own words. Even letters from distant provinces began with the phrase, "To the Lord and God Nero, guardian of eternity." This wasn't correspondence, it was confession. The empire no longer governed through law, it governed through flattery. By then, Nero had stopped listening entirely. Music replaced counsel. He built a private theatre inside the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, where he performed songs about his own glory, while Rome's senators applauded like trained choirs. He didn't need approval, he needed audience. The empire had become his stage, and the people, his props. But isolation is not peace, it is pressure. Every whisper in the hallway became a threat. Every silence felt like a conspiracy. When no one contradicts you, every thought sounds true, and every doubt becomes betrayal. The emperor's paranoia grew like ivy around the palace walls. He began to suspect his own bloodline, accusing his aunt, then his wife, then his tutors. Seneca, the man who had once taught him the meaning of virtue, was forced to kill himself in silence. A philosopher sacrificed to his own pupil's fear. Rome itself mirrored the emperor's state of mind. Walls were painted with scenes of gods punishing mortals for disobedience. Coins bore inscriptions celebrating eternal harmony, even as the streets filled with informers and spies. The city that once called itself Urbs Libera, the free city, now moved in whispers. No one could tell where reverence ended and terror began. Isolation had reached its perfection. The emperor was surrounded by millions, yet touched by none. His meals were tasted by slaves, his bed guarded by soldiers, his words rehearsed before being spoken. Every precaution meant to protect him only deepened the void. He had all of Rome's wealth, but none of its warmth. Even his own laughter echoed back hollow. Historians like Tacitus and Suetonius wrote that Nero desired to be loved, but feared he never was. That paradox defined every emperor after him. Domitian, Commodus, even Caracalla would repeat it, each more paranoid, each more alone. Isolation was not the side effect of divinity, it was its proof. To be a god in Rome was to live without equals, and therefore without reality. But the empire could not survive on worship alone. A god can rule temples, not armies. As Nero withdrew into fantasy, the machinery of state began to rot. The Senate became ornamental. Governors grew corrupt without oversight. The economy twisted around Nero's excesses. Palaces of gold, while granaries emptied. Even the games, once public displays of imperial generosity, turned grotesque, used not to entertain, but to remind the people who could kill whom. The deeper Nero retreated into his isolation, the louder the empire pretended to celebrate him. When he sang in the theatre, the crowd shouted, "Divine voice." When he burned Rome to rebuild it, poets called it the purification of the world. Even the smoke became incense. But every empire built on applause eventually runs out of breath. In AD 68, when rebellion finally reached the gates of Rome, Nero hid in a servant's villa, trembling, alone, terrified of the silence he had created. He asked his companion one last question before taking his life. Is this what gods feel when they die? The answer, history suggests, is yes. Because Rome's emperors didn't die of assassination or revolt. They died of isolation. By the time Nero's paranoia reached its height, fear was no longer a symptom. It was a system. Rome had found a way to industrialize suspicion. Behind every senator, servant, and soldier stood another, watching, listening, recording. And at the center of this web sat the emperor, convinced that only absolute control could preserve his life, and by extension, his empire. Paranoia in Rome wasn't madness in the private sense. It was paperwork. Lists of suspected traitors, inventories of whispers, registers of dreams interpreted as omens. Spies had quotas. Informants were paid in coin, property, or freedom. Even silence became taxable. If you heard a rumor and failed to report it, you were guilty of conspiracy. The law itself no longer punished action. It punished uncertainty. Under Nero, fear was codified. Under Domitian, it was perfected. Domitian began each morning by signing death warrants, then eating breakfast in silence. He had mirrors polished to perfection, not to admire himself, but to detect assassins approaching from behind. He banned anyone from wearing rings or jewelry in his presence, in case they reflected his face. For him, reflection meant vulnerability. And when an emperor fears his own reflection, paranoia becomes theology. The imperial court adapted quickly. Flattery became a survival skill. Betrayal, a form of currency. Senators accused one another to prove loyalty. Friends denounced friends before being denounced themselves. It was an empire of self-erasure, a society that ate its own tongue before it could speak truth. The Praetorian Guard, once Rome's elite protectors, became brokers of terror. They didn't defend the emperor, they audited him. Loyalty had a price, paid daily in gifts, spectacles, and blood. When Nero or Domitian sensed discontent, they raised the soldiers' pay and executed a few nobles to reassure the ranks. Fear was now the empire's currency, circulating faster than gold. To maintain the illusion of divine order, the emperors turned paranoia into ritual. Omens were studied, sacrifices repeated, stars interpreted for hidden threats. Every eclipse meant a plot. Every dream foretold betrayal. Religion itself was rewritten as intelligence. The priests who once prayed for fertility now tracked potential rebels. The augurs, those who read bird flights for signs from the gods, became early bureaucrats of surveillance. When faith becomes surveillance, the divine turns into an intelligence agency. Even the law followed suit. The lex majestatis, the law of treason, expanded beyond action to intention. To joke about the emperor's singing voice, to yawn during his speech, to hesitate during applause, all became prosecutable offenses. The courtroom became theatre, the verdict preordained. But unlike the games of the Colosseum, these performances didn't entertain, they instructed. Every public trial was a sermon on obedience. Every execution was an administrative act of faith. This was the genius of Roman fear. It was rationalized. Each cruelty came with a justification, each paranoia with a policy memo. Domitian claimed the purges kept Rome pure. Nero declared executions necessary acts of divine correction. Caligula said the same, smiling as he signed orders with the phrase, "Let them understand I am still alive." Their madness had become measurable, governed by rules, stamped by clerks, sanctified by law. Historians often describe these emperors as insane, but insanity implies loss of reason. What if they hadn't lost it, but repurposed it? Their paranoia was not chaos, it was management. A way to automate fear, to transform emotion into infrastructure. Every denunciation kept the machine turning. Every arrest reminded the empire that terror was order. Even the common people learned the logic. Neighbors spied on neighbors, not out of hatred, but to survive. Mothers warned their children not to speak names too loudly in markets. Poets burned their own work. Philosophers recited praises to avoid suspicion. Rome didn't simply obey its emperors, it internalized them. Fear migrated from the throne into the mind. The empire no longer needed chains, the citizens carried them inside. And through it all, the Senate pretended this was stability, because the alternative, admitting that the system itself was diseased, would mean collective suicide. It was safer to call fear devotion, and madness governance. By the end of the 1st century, Rome was a city without trust. Every smile was a calculation, every silence a strategy. And yet, paradoxically, it functioned. Taxes collected, roads maintained, legions marched. The empire lived, but its soul was administrative terror. It had become what every tyrant dreams of, a perfectly organized nightmare. Every emperor inherited not a throne, but a wound. Rome's power came with a ghost, the memory of every ruler who fell to the same fear he once inflicted. Each new emperor swore he would be different, more just, more loved. But in Rome, the performance of mercy was always the first act of cruelty. When Vespasian restored order after Nero's suicide, he promised a new beginning. He rebuilt the treasury, reopened the Senate, and ended the reign of terror. Rome cheered the return of stability, but beneath the applause was a quiet expectation. That stability must be paid for in blood. The empire had learned to equate fear with safety, and no emperor could escape that logic. So Vespasian raised taxes, crushed revolts in Judea, and began construction on the Flavian amphitheatre, what we now call the Colosseum. It was more than a monument, it was a statement that peace required spectacle, and that every dynasty must prove its legitimacy through controlled violence. He called it restoring order. History would call it systematic inheritance. His son, Titus, followed in his image, dutiful, disciplined, but haunted. He knew that kindness without terror was a weakness Rome would not tolerate. When Mount Vesuvius erupted, he poured money into relief efforts, wept publicly for the victims, and was celebrated as the darling of mankind. But within a year, plague and famine followed, and whispers began again. The gods are angry. Titus died young, worn by guilt and exhaustion, leaving behind an empire that demanded compassion and feared it at once. Then came Domitian, the younger brother who learned that love was fatal. Where Titus sought affection, Domitian sought control. He doubled the army's pay, tightened laws, and ruled from behind locked doors. He turned fear into a family business. Every edict, every punishment, every whisper of dissent was recorded like temple offerings. Domitian called it discipline. The Senate called it tyranny. But the people called it normal. Because by then, cruelty had become tradition. Each emperor inherited not policies, but precedents, blueprints for survival. Nero's vanity became state religion. Caligula's paranoia became administrative instinct. Domitian's austerity became law. Rome's history wasn't a line of rulers. It was a genealogy of fear. Every empire has an accounting system for violence. Rome's was lineage. To inherit power was to inherit suspicion, the expectation of revolt, and the need to overperform ruthlessness. An emperor who hesitated became a martyr. One who acted swiftly became divine. Mercy was never remembered. Cruelty always was. By the 2nd century, this inheritance had hardened into bureaucracy. New emperors came to power not by birth, but by precedent. The Senate demanded displays of moral strength, a clean purge, a public execution, a demonstration of virtues, Roman manliness. To rule meant to repeat the ritual, reassure the people through the language of fear. Even good emperors like Trajan or Marcus Aurelius could not break free. Trajan's justice was built on conquest, his charity on plunder. Marcus wrote about peace, yet presided over wars that fed the empire's appetite for control. They were trapped in what philosophers later called the tyranny of precedent, a civilization too intelligent to be savage, yet too frightened to be gentle. Legacy in Rome was not memory. It was infection. Each emperor caught the same disease, disguised it as virtue, and passed it on. They built temples to reason while sacrificing reason itself. They praised law even as they twisted it to fit their fears. In the marble of every forum, the empire engraved its contradictions. Justice beside dominion, peace beside triumph, mercy beside execution. And the people believed. They always believed. Because after centuries of propaganda, Romans had forgotten the difference between peace and obedience. They had learned to love stability more than freedom. And that love, the craving for predictable order, was what bound them to their rulers, even the cruel ones. So every emperor faced the same impossible burden: to maintain the illusion of civilization while feeding the machinery of terror that sustained it. The throne was not a seat. It was a tightrope stretched between admiration and annihilation. To fall one way was weakness, to fall the other, madness. No wonder every ruler ended the same: isolated, paranoid, divine. Rome called this continuity. History calls it pathology. By the 2nd century, Rome had mastered the art of forgetting. It learned to bury cruelty beneath applause, to disguise fear as celebration. The empire no longer needed terror in the streets. It had the arena. The Colosseum was not entertainment. It was architecture designed to ritualize obedience. 50,000 people could fit inside. Senators beside slaves, nobles beside beggars, all equal before the empire's theater of death. Here, blood was democracy. And every drop that touched the sand reaffirmed one truth, that Rome's order was sacred, and suffering was its sacrament. When Vespasian began the project, he called it Munus Populi Romani, the gift to the Roman people. But the word munus had another meaning: obligation, a gift that must be repaid in loyalty, gratitude, and silence. That was the true economy of spectacle, obedience bought with horror. In the mornings, beasts were slaughtered. At noon, prisoners were executed. And in the afternoon, men fought men until the crowd decided who deserved to live. The emperor presided over it all, not as judge, but as priest. He lifted his thumb, and thousands shouted in one voice, "Of Caesar!" It was not just a greeting, it was a confession of faith. The games had begun as funerary rites centuries earlier, offerings to the dead. Now they had become a bureaucratic machine. Accountants recorded how many lions were imported from Numidia, how many prisoners from Dacia, how many blades were forged in Hispania. Supply chains of death managed like trade. The empire had turned cruelty into logistics. Gladiators themselves were assets, catalogued, trained, insured. Their blood had price tags. Their survival rates were statistical reports. For every man who died, Rome profited twice, once in spectacle and once in silence. Because when people cheered for the death of another, they learned to accept their own subjugation. Even philosophy bowed to the arena. Seneca called the games necessary displays of courage. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, attended them as moral lessons, meditating on human mortality while men screamed below him. In Rome, even virtue needed victims. The more the empire decayed, the greater the need for spectacle. Each crisis, plague, revolt, famine, was followed by new festivals, longer games, louder cheers. As the empire's economy strained, the games became cheaper, but crueler. Wooden swords were replaced by real steel. Exotic animals ran out, so prisoners filled their place. Mythological plays were reenacted with real deaths. Orpheus torn by beasts, Prometheus chained for the crowd's delight. Art became autopsy. Culture became cruelty refined. The Colosseum was not a symbol of Rome's strength. It was a monument to its exhaustion, a civilization trying to feel alive through the destruction of others. When the people grew numb, the empire bled louder. The crowd's ecstasy became the empire's anesthesia. It wasn't just about violence. It was about control through emotion. The emperor's role was not merely to rule, but to regulate feeling. When to weep, when to cheer, when to hate. Fear was privatized. Joy was nationalized. Every citizen's heartbeat belonged to the state. That was the secret purpose of spectacle. It turned individuals into a single, obedient rhythm. The same system applied to art, poetry, and triumph. Every victory parade ended in public humiliation of prisoners, a moral warning wrapped in celebration. Every temple dedication included sacrifices, to remind Rome that even the gods demanded blood. Even the calendar itself became an imperial device. More than 100 public festivals a year, each a day when thought was replaced by noise. To the Romans, silence was dangerous. Spectacle drowned it. As long as the people were watching, they were not thinking. And as long as they were cheering, they could not question. But numbness has a price. Once cruelty becomes ritual, empathy becomes impossible. By the 3rd century, Rome's rulers no longer understood what horror meant. They had seen too much to be moved, too much to believe that pain was real. And when a civilization stops feeling, it stops fearing itself. The arena taught them that destruction could be orderly, that death could be beautiful if choreographed correctly. That illusion, the aesthetic of horror, was Rome's final masterpiece. It taught the empire how to die gracefully, because when Nero sang, when Titus built, when Commodus fought in the arena dressed as Hercules, they weren't celebrating life. They were performing Rome's funeral, one applause at a time. By the 3rd century, Rome had achieved what no civilization before it dared to imagine: a functioning economy built on madness. Pain had become quantifiable, fear profitable, and death itself a renewable resource. The imperial treasury kept immaculate records: the cost of lions per shipment, the wage of executioners, the maintenance of prisons, the tax revenue from slave markets. Every cruelty had a ledger line, every corpse was an entry. Rome had done what philosophers thought impossible. It had turned suffering into infrastructure. It started with the spectacles, but it didn't end there. The Colosseum was just the prototype, a public ritual of accounting. Every death was budgeted, every scream a receipt. But outside the arena, a quieter, more efficient system evolved. Workhouses, quarries, and mines became the empire's hidden arenas. Thousands of slaves, prisoners, and debtors toiled underground in darkness, their labor financing the games that distracted the citizens above. The empire had become a perfect circle of exploitation. Death funded entertainment, and entertainment justified death. The numbers tell the story better than any chronicle. A healthy slave in the quarries of Sicily was worth 2,000 sesterces. A gladiator in training, 15,000. A lion from Numidia, 30,000. A dead slave, taxable property loss, reimbursed through imperial insurance. The Roman accountant didn't distinguish between wheat, marble, or flesh. If it could be owned, it could be counted. If it could be counted, it could be controlled. And yet, this was not chaos. It was elegant. Rome didn't revel in cruelty for its own sake. It organized it. Executions were scheduled alongside grain distributions, slave shipments synchronized with festivals. Even temple offerings were tied to imperial profits. Pain became seasonal, and profit divine. The empire called this administratio divina, divine administration. A theology of management that fused religion, economy, and control. The gods demanded sacrifice. The state provided victims. Faith became an accounting department. Temples issued receipts for offerings, and priests submitted expense reports to the treasury. The divine had been bureaucratized. This system reached its height under Commodus, who blurred the lines completely. He didn't just sponsor the games, he participated. Each time he stepped into the arena, he charged the state 1 million sesterces for divine presence. He executed prisoners dressed as mythic monsters so that he could defeat evil before the crowd. Each performance was an invoice to Rome's conscience. The emperor was both executioner and expense. But behind the theatre lay a colder arithmetic. Conquest demanded cost efficiency. Wars were no longer fought for defense or honor, but for balance sheets. Dacia, Britannia, Parthia. Every campaign was justified by its resource yield: gold mines, slaves, timber. these were not spoils of war, but investment returns. The legions were accountants with swords. Even the economy of faith followed the same model. New gods meant new temples, new taxes, new pilgrims. When traditional religion began to fade, emperors introduced new cults: Sol Invictus, Mithras, Isis, each with its own financial network of offerings, festivals, and merchandise. Rome monetized belief. Even divinity was franchised. This was the true genius of Rome. Not the sword, not the aqueduct, but the invoice. Where other empires ruled through blood, Rome ruled through balance. To be Roman was to be part of an equation. Your worth measured not by virtue, but by yield. But no equation can sustain infinite loss. By the late 3rd century, the machine began to choke on its own perfection. The empire was spending more to maintain order than it could earn through conquest. The economy of cruelty had reached diminishing returns. Spectacles became rarer, not out of compassion, but bankruptcy. The arenas fell silent, not because Rome grew moral, but because Rome went broke. And yet, even in collapse, the system refused to die. When Diocletian came to power, he simply nationalized the madness. He introduced the edict on maximum prices, fixing the cost of everything from bread to burial, including slaves and entertainers. It was an empire trying to legislate its own decay, to control even the rate at which it fell apart. Diocletian didn't rebuild Rome, he audited it. He divided the empire into administrative zones, each with its own quotas of labor, grain, and sacrifice. Bureaucracy replaced conquest. The sword gave way to the seal. The emperor was now less a god than a manager of decline, the high priest of an exhausted system still pretending to be eternal. Historians call this reform. But in truth, it was Rome's final delusion, the belief that numbers could govern morality, that control could substitute for conscience. It was the last stage of madness, not chaos, but calculation. By the late 3rd century, Rome was no longer an empire. It was a performance. The marble columns still stood, the laws were still recited, the soldiers still marched. But beneath the ceremony, governance had become theatre. Rome wasn't being ruled anymore, it was being staged. After centuries of conquest, the empire could no longer afford its own reality. So, it manufactured illusion instead. The emperors understood this better than anyone. They had learned that appearances were stronger than armies. If you could make the people believe the empire was eternal, then it didn't matter that it was collapsing. Diocletian formalized this illusion into ritual. He surrounded himself with gold curtains, jeweled diadems, and choreographed silence. Visitors had to prostrate themselves, not before a ruler, but before a god reenacting sovereignty. He called it Dominatus, the divine authority. In practice, it was theatre protocol written into law. Every gesture, every entrance, every pause was rehearsed. Rome had found a way to script obedience. The state no longer existed to govern. It existed to perform governance. The Senate debated nothing. Edicts were issued for problems that didn't exist. Tax reforms were announced for provinces already lost. Bureaucrats stamped decrees that no one read, and priests blessed temples that no one believed in. It was as if the empire itself was miming its former greatness, a ghost repeating its lines to an empty audience. The illusion extended even to war. Triumphs continued, but the victories were staged. Parades celebrated battles that never happened, generals who had bribed their way to glory. Prisoners of war were actors. Gold crowns were recycled. The rituals had outlived their purpose, but they kept the illusion alive. Rome didn't need to win wars anymore. It only needed to look undefeated. This was the final transformation of Roman cruelty, from reality to representation. The empire no longer needed blood to sustain itself. It needed applause, and the crowd, exhausted by centuries of spectacle, still played along. The people cheered for stability, not freedom. They no longer asked for truth, only for continuity. In a sense, the empire had achieved immortality, not in substance, but in performance. Power survived as costume. Law survived as choreography. The empire had replaced meaning with repetition. What had once been tyranny became ceremony, and what had once been fear became nostalgia. Even Christianity, rising through the cracks of the old order, adapted to the spectacle. The same architecture of power, processions, incense, hierarchy, simply changed costumes. The empire's need for performance did not die. It merely changed its script. The bishop replaced the emperor. The altar replaced the throne. Faith inherited the stage that power had built. Rome had baptized its own theatre. By the time Constantine moved the capital to Byzantium, the transformation was complete. The empire had split between two realities: a West still clinging to its ruins, and an East pretending the play could go on forever. Constantine's conversion to Christianity wasn't revelation. It was adaptation. He understood what every Roman ruler had learned too late, that the performance was the power. If people believed in salvation, they would endure anything. And so the empire continued, not as territory, but as narrative. Its bureaucracy became theology. Its rituals became religion. Its emperors became saints. Rome had discovered a form of immortality not even marble could match: belief. But belief built on illusion cannot heal decay. Behind the curtains of divine order, famine spread. Cities shrank. Soldiers deserted for bandits. The empire was now a play with no stagehands, only actors repeating lines they no longer understood. The lights were still on, but the audience had left. Historians call this period late antiquity, but perhaps a better name is Rome's encore, a civilization refusing to leave the stage. Its final centuries were not a collapse, but a slow improvisation, a desperate attempt to keep the music playing after the song had ended. When the state becomes theatre and the people become audience, truth ceases to matter. Only spectacle remains. That was the last miracle of Rome. It taught the world that illusion can outlive empire. By the 4th century, insanity was no longer the emperor's burden. It was everyone's routine. The empire had survived its own collapse by normalizing the impossible. Madness was no longer a symptom to be cured, it was a condition to be managed. The citizens had grown accustomed to contradiction. They prayed for mercy at temples built by conquest. They praised justice under rulers who murdered their kin. They celebrated peace in a state that never stopped preparing for war. To live in Rome was to inhabit a double reality, a world where hypocrisy wasn't hidden, it was institutional. Laws were still issued in the emperor's name, but they no longer described reality. they were scripts for a world that didn't exist. One edict ordered fair taxation on provinces already burned. Another regulated the price of slaves in markets that no longer traded. The bureaucracy continued to function, not because it worked, but because it couldn't imagine stopping. That was the genius of Rome's decay, inertia disguised as order. When Constantine legalized Christianity, it was hailed as a new dawn. But what it truly signified was adaptation, the empire baptizing its madness. Christianity offered new vocabulary, not new morality. The same imperial instincts, hierarchy, surveillance, ritual, found new costumes. The bishop's robes replaced the senator's toga. The cross replaced the eagle. But beneath the symbols, the same logic endured. Salvation through obedience. Redemption through suffering. Rome hadn't converted. It had rebranded. The empire's population accepted the transformation because it offered something precious: meaning. After centuries of war, plague, and famine, the people didn't want truth. They wanted coherence. They didn't mind that the empire was crumbling, as long as it crumbled with ceremony. And so they followed the new rituals with the same fervor they once reserved for the old. Confession replaced denunciation. Procession replaced parade. The machinery of devotion simply changed uniforms. The administrators, once accountants of cruelty, now became accountants of salvation. Instead of tracking slaves, they tracked souls. The empire's ledgers now recorded donations, tithes, and penances. Pain still had a price. Only now it was paid in faith. The theology of empire and the bureaucracy of religion had merged into one seamless system. Every confession became a form of census. Every act of charity, a line item in the moral economy of redemption. Historians call this period the Christianization of the empire. But, in truth, it was the empirization of Christianity. Rome didn't vanish. It metastasized into spirit. The madness that once ruled from marble palaces now whispered from pulpits. Where once emperors demanded worship, now bishops demanded repentance. Different words, same obedience. Even the architecture spoke the same language. The basilica, once the imperial courthouse, became the Christian church. The apse, where judges once sat in judgment, now framed the altar. Law had become liturgy. Faith had become administration. And insanity, the fusion of power and righteousness, had become sacred. In this new world, contradiction became virtue. To believe two opposites at once was proof of faith. To question logic was heresy, and to obey blindly was sanctity. What had begun as a political reflex, the refusal to face truth, evolved into a theological principle. Rome had perfected the moral alchemy of empire, turning fear into piety and obedience into holiness. The people adjusted with frightening ease. They no longer recoiled from cruelty, because it wore holy robes. Executions became martyrdoms. Censorship became purity. Taxation became tithe. Every chain was repainted gold and called divine order. Insanity had not been abolished. It had been canonized. Philosophers who once questioned emperors now debated the nature of angels. The same intellects that once designed laws now designed dogma. They wrote treatises proving that submission was freedom and that suffering was love. It wasn't hypocrisy, it was necessity. When reality is unbearable, doctrine becomes architecture. And Rome, master builder of illusions, constructed its greatest one yet, the illusion that decay was salvation. By the 5th century, few even remembered a world without paradox. A city could burn, a province could vanish, and the people would call it divine mystery. No one demanded answers anymore. They only demanded meaning. The empire had taught them well. Better a lie that gives comfort than a truth that gives pain. This was Rome's final evolution, a civilization that had domesticated madness. It no longer needed cruelty to control. Belief was enough. Obedience had become instinct. Insanity had become ordinary. And order, the illusion of it, was the last religion Rome ever truly believed in. By the 5th century, even faith, Rome's last currency, began to devalue. What had once held the empire together no longer inspired awe, only exhaustion. The rituals continued, but their meaning leaked away like water through cracked marble. The empire had outlived belief itself. Churches rose from the ruins of temples, yet the faces inside were the same. Senators became bishops, generals became saints, and tax collectors became priests. The empire hadn't converted. It had changed uniforms. The same hands that once raised whips now lifted crosses. Redemption had become just another form of taxation. The citizens obeyed, not because they believed, but because they were afraid of emptiness. For centuries, Rome had taught them that meaning was something granted from above, by gods, by emperors, by priests. They no longer knew how to live without authority. To doubt was to fall into the abyss. So they clung to forms, to rituals stripped of spirit, to words that sounded holy but no longer healed. In this new Rome, even the divine felt administrative. Confession had time slots. Prayer required paperwork. Faith was measured by attendance, devotion by donation. The old bureaucracy had returned in holy vestments. And just as before, salvation was an invoice, but something deeper was rotting. As invasions struck from the north and famines spread across the countryside, the empire's spiritual structure began to crack. The gods had changed names, but they were still silent. And silence, once sacred, now sounded like absence. For the first time in centuries, people began to suspect the unthinkable, that Rome's divine order had never been divine at all, only well-managed illusion. The collapse began quietly, not with rebellion, but with fatigue. In villages, peasants stopped attending mass. In cities, statues of saints were melted down to make tools. Priests spoke of eternal kingdoms while the real one disintegrated under their feet. The people still prayed, but their prayers no longer expected answers. They prayed because they didn't know what else to do. By the time the Visigoths breached Rome's walls in 410, the city didn't scream, it sighed. The world's eternal capital had died long before its gates fell. When Alaric's troops marched through the streets, they found no resistance, only ghosts rehearsing obedience. The empire didn't collapse from force, it eroded from meaning. Saint Augustine, watching from North Africa, wrote, "The City of God," an attempt to explain how a divine empire could die. His answer was devastating. Rome had confused dominion with destiny, power with purpose. It had worshipped order so long it forgot how to live without it. And when order itself decayed, so did faith. Augustine tried to relocate eternity, away from empire into heaven. But even that was a confession of loss. He was not saving Rome, he was writing its epitaph. The empire's final centuries became a dialogue between ruins and scripture. Every broken column was a verse, every crumbled wall a sermon on impermanence. The same hands that once carved laws into stone now copied gospels onto parchment. Rome had traded its monuments for manuscripts, marble for meaning. But the question lingered like ash. If the truth can survive only in books, has it truly survived at all? What perished was not just an empire, but the human belief that order equals virtue. Rome's genius, its capacity to turn chaos into ceremony, became its curse. For centuries, it had sanctified control and baptized cruelty. Now, stripped of both, it had nothing left to worship but its own memory. And yet, in that collapse lay the seed of something new. When systems fail, symbols become soil. The ruins of Rome didn't end history, they fertilized it. From its shattered bureaucracy rose monasteries, micro-empires of silence and preservation. From its collapsed administration came literacy, copied word by word in candlelight. The madness that once ruled by spectacle would now whisper through scripture. The empire's cruelty had been replaced by contemplation, its noise by patience. But one truth remained unchanged. Rome never truly died. It merely changed form again and again, as it always had. From republic to empire, from empire to church, from church to idea. It taught the world the most dangerous lesson of all, that illusion, if well organized, can outlast truth. Because when meaning collapses, systems don't disappear, they adapt. And so the machinery of control survived, baptized anew, waiting for its next master. Rome did not fall, it diffused. Its empire of stone dissolved into an empire of Pohort. The walls crumbled, but the architecture of control endured, invisible, portable, and eternal. It lived on in every system that prized obedience over truth, spectacle over conscience, and order over justice. From the ashes of the Forum rose new empires with different names but identical blueprints. Kings crowned by divine right, churches declaring infallibility, nations demanding unity. Each inherited Rome's sacred disease, the belief that power, if sanctified, ceases to be accountable. Rome's ghost lingered in the modern imagination, not as a ruin, but as a template. Every government that wraps its laws in holiness, every corporation that measures humanity in numbers, every regime that demands silence for stability, they all recite Rome's liturgy. The empire survives wherever obedience masquerades as faith and cruelty as necessity. Even our language carries the infection. Civilization still means Rome. Order still implies obedience. Justice still demands punishment. The Latin roots of our laws, our prayers, our politics, all trace back to the same logic, that to govern others, one must first convince them that pain can be sacred. 2,000 years later, we still build our arenas. They just have new names. The Colosseum became the news feed. The gladiator became the dissident. The crowd still cheers, and the state still watches. Our spectacles are cleaner, quieter, but no less cruel. We no longer throw bodies to the lions. We throw reputations, careers, nations. We call it progress. Rome would have called it refinement. The emperor's divinity survives too, disguised as charisma, ideology, or data. We no longer worship gods in flesh, but we still build altars to power. The modern ruler doesn't need temples. He has algorithms. He doesn't need marble statues. He has metrics. Every click, every vote, every silence is still a confession. The ledgers never stopped. They simply went digital. We have inherited Rome's perfection, the ability to turn control into ritual, and ritual into truth. Our systems no longer require belief, only participation. We obey not because we fear divine wrath, but because the machine runs smoother when we do. The empire no longer needs priests or emperors. It needs only functionaries and followers. And like Rome, it convinces us that efficiency is morality. Perhaps that is the final victory of Rome, that it made its madness invisible by making it normal. It taught the world that order is preferable to freedom, that silence is safer than thought, that obedience feels like peace. Rome's true immortality lies not in its monuments, but in its habits. We live among them still. And yet, the ghost of empire does not haunt the marble. It haunts the mirror. Because the truth is not that Rome lives in our governments, but in us. Every time we justify cruelty as discipline, every time we silence dissent for harmony, every time we measure worth in productivity instead of principle, we reopen the ledger. The emperors of old ruled through spectacle and fear. Ours rule through comfort and distraction. Where Nero burned cities, we burn time. Where Domitian built statues, we build screens. The medium changed. The method didn't. Rome discovered that control need not look violent. It only needs to feel natural. We tell ourselves we are freer, wiser, immune to the old disease. But look closer. Every app that tracks behavior, every camera on every street corner, every performance of outrage followed by silence. These are the new rituals of empire. Instead of priests, we have programmers. Instead of decrees, we have terms of service. And the gods we serve are not divine. They are designed. The modern citizen, like the Roman subject, mistakes visibility for agency. We post, we speak, we react, but rarely resist. Our public squares are digital, but the architecture is the same. Columns of code, amphitheaters of opinion, crowds managed by invisible curators. We feel seen, but we are not heard. Just as the senators once clapped in Nero's theatre, we too applaud the very systems that record our applause. Rome's genius was never its brutality. It was its ability to convince its victims that they were participants. And so it remains. The algorithms don't force obedience. They suggest it. The screens don't command worship. They earn it. And when obedience feels voluntary, control becomes complete. Look at the modern monuments. Skyscrapers of glass, data centers that hum like temples of light. Inside them, servers hold more names than any census in history. Every purchase, every movement, every heartbeat recorded. A new census for a digital empire. Augustus would envy such precision. Domitian would marvel at such surveillance. Rome's ambition has been fulfilled, not in marble, but in code. The algorithms that shape our lives have inherited the emperor's logic. They promise order through calculation, harmony through control, and safety through surrender. And like the Roman gods, they demand offerings, not in gold, but in data. Our desires, our fears, our patterns of consumption, all tithed daily to unseen powers. It is faith by repetition, devotion by design. Every society eventually builds its Colosseum. The difference is that ours fits in our hands. We feed it our attention, our outrage, our empathy, and it feeds us noise until silence feels unbearable. The crowd's roar never fades. It just changes pitch. The empire of distraction, like the empire of blood, depends on one thing: a population too entertained to notice its own chains. In Rome, spectacle was currency. Today, it's content. And just like the emperors, our leaders understand that visibility is power. They rule not through decree, but through narrative, controlling not what people must do, but what they must discuss. Control of attention is control of reality. Rome discovered that truth doesn't have to be destroyed, only drowned. We no longer need an emperor to sanctify our obedience. We do it ourselves. We call it productivity, patriotism, professionalism. We sacrifice time, thought, even empathy, not to Jupiter or Christ, but to systems we can't name and dare not question. The empire no longer tells us what to believe. It tells us what to value, and we comply quietly, efficiently. The language of Rome persists in our institutions: Senate, forum, justice, authority. But their meanings have hollowed. Like the marble busts in the Capitoline Museum, the forms remain beautiful, dignified, and lifeless. We inherited the posture of Rome, but not its conscience. And so our modern virtues echo ancient vices in new dialects. Order without empathy becomes cruelty. Law without wisdom becomes tyranny. Faith without doubt becomes fanaticism. Rome perfected all three, and so have we. We imprison dissent with rhetoric, not chains. We sanitize conquest with economics, not swords. We baptize inequality with merit, not birthright. Progress has only refined the instruments of hierarchy. That is why Rome never died, because it never had to. It taught the world to mistake submission for civilization. And we, grateful for comfort, mistook civilization for salvation. But not all ghosts haunt to destroy. Some haunt to remind. The ruins still whisper warnings beneath their dust. That power, when left unexamined, will always seek sanctity. That cruelty, when justified as order, becomes invisible. That empires don't die when they fall. They die when their people stop asking questions. When law sanctifies madness, when power wears the mask of virtue, who judges the divine? We never answered that question. We only learned to avoid asking it. Every empire since has rewritten it in softer ink, but the ledger is the same. Pain transformed into proof, obedience mistaken for faith, control disguised as civilization. The ruins of Rome stand as warning, not nostalgia. They remind us that collapse is never sudden. It's a process of surrender. One compromise, one silence, one justification at a time. Civilizations don't fall when they're conquered. They fall when they forget why they were built. And yet, there's one consolation in the rubble. As long as we can still hear the echo of that question, as long as bones still speak beneath the marble, Rome's madness hasn't won completely, because memory, too, is rebellion. To remember is to judge. To name the madness is to limit its power. So listen, beneath every courtroom, every cathedral, every server farm, you can still hear the empire humming. Its machinery of faith and fear, disguised as progress, turns ceaselessly. But now we have the ledgers, the bones, and the silence to answer it back. If you value the record, remember this. Every system that worships order over truth carries Rome within it. And every citizen who dares to ask, who judges the divine, keeps the world from becoming an empire again. But the ledger never truly closes. It only changes hands. Each age reopens it under a new seal: republic, church, nation, algorithm. Every entry looks different, yet the arithmetic is the same. Pain balanced against progress, obedience disguised as order. We still calculate worth the Roman way, not by virtue, but by productivity. Our temples are offices, our priests wear suits. The incense is digital, the prayers automated. And like the emperors, we mistake efficiency for enlightenment. We call our systems rational, humane, modern. Yet, they demand the same sacrifices: silence, complicity, and the surrender of conscience. Perhaps that's the real empire. Not Rome itself, but the human instinct to sanctify control, to turn fear into policy, to mistake management for morality. We inherited not their ruins, but their reflex. Still, the ruins whisper something gentler. Amid the marble dust lies a warning carved by time itself, that no civilization, no matter how divine it calls itself, can survive when its gods forget to be human. Rome's madness wasn't its cruelty. It was its conviction that cruelty could be justified. And every empire that follows carries a fragment of that conviction, like a hidden relic. The choice, then, has always been ours: to repeat the ritual, or to remember the cost, to build new ledgers, or to finally close them. So when we stand in the shadow of any system, political, religious, digital, and feel the urge to call it eternal, we should pause, listen beneath the stone, and ask the question Rome taught us to fear. When law sanctifies madness, who judges the divine? Because if we ever stop asking, then Rome, in all its madness and majesty, will have truly risen again, not in the ruins, but in us.